Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. In this video, we will learn how to ignore files in Git. We do this using a special file called gitignore. A gitignore file is just a simple text file. Inside it, you list all the files and folders that you want Git to permanently ignore. When a file is ignored, it will not be tracked, it will not be committed, and it will not even show up in your Git status as an untracked file. You should use this file to keep your repository clean. You use it to ignore things like compiled code, log files, and system junk files. Most importantly, you use it to ignore massive dependency folders. And you must always use it to ignore any file containing secrets, like passwords or API keys. In the next section, we will learn how to create one and what the syntax looks like. Okay, let's learn how to create a gitignore file. It is just a simple text file, and you must name it exactly gitignore, starting with a dot. You should always place this file in the root directory of your project. Inside the file, you just list the files or folders you want to ignore, with one pattern on each line. The rules are simple. Lines starting with a hash sign are comments. To ignore all files of a certain type, you use an asterisk. To ignore an entire directory, you type its name, followed by a /. To ignore a specific file, you just type its name. You can also ignore files in a specific path. And if you need to make an exception, you can use an exclamation mark. In the next section, we will break each of these patterns down, starting with how to ignore a specific file. Okay, let's look at our first specific example, how to ignore a single specific file. This is the most basic rule. You just open your gitignore file and type the full name of the file you want to ignore. That is it. Now let's see it in action. Before you update your gitignore file, if you run git status, you will see secrets listed as an untracked file. Now you add secrets to your gitignore file and save it. If you run git status again, secrets is gone. It has disappeared from the list. Git is now successfully ignoring it. The only new file you will see is the gitignore file itself, which you should now commit to your repository. In the next section, we will learn how to ignore all files of a certain type, like log files. Now let's look at one of the most common and powerful rules, how to ignore files by their extension. For this, we use the asterisk, or star, as a wildcard. The asterisk matches any set of characters. So the pattern star.log will match and ignore any file that ends with log extension, no matter what its name is. This is perfect for ignoring all of your files based on a specific extension. Let's see an example. Before you update your gitignore file, git status shows all the files with log extension. You then add star.log to your gitignore file. When you run git status again, all the log files are gone. Git is now ignoring all files with that extension, no matter what directory they are in. In the next section, we will look at how to ignore an entire directory. Next, let's look at another important rule, how to ignore an entire directory. You do this by typing the directory's name, followed by a /. That one line will ignore the entire folder and every single file inside it, no matter how many there are. This is absolutely essential for ignoring large dependency folders. Let's see an example. Before you update your gitignore file, if you run npm install, your git status will be flooded with thousands of untracked files from node modules. Then you add node modules followed by a / to your gitignore file. When you run git status again, all of those files are gone. Git is now ignoring that entire directory. In the next section, we will learn the difference between ignoring a file everywhere versus in just one specific spot. Now let's look at how to ignore a file by its name, no matter where it is in your project. This is perfect for system junk files. To ignore these, you just type their names into your gitignore file. Unlike other patterns, Git will automatically match these names in any directory, whether it is the root or in any other subdirectory. For example, say you want to ignore all instances of your API key, irrespective of its location in your project directory structure. In your gitignore file, simply add an entry for API key. After you add to your gitignore, if you run the git status command, API key will not appear. Git is now ignoring those files everywhere. But what if you only want to ignore a file in one specific folder? We will cover that in the next section. Next, let's learn how to ignore a file, but only in one specific directory. For example, you might want to ignore a file, but only when it is inside a specific folder. To do this, you write the full path in your gitignore file. This pattern will not ignore the file in any other folder. Let's see an example. Before you update your file, git status might show two files, debug log in the root and log directory. Now you add log/debug log to your gitignore file. When you run git status again, the debug log under log directory is no longer shown, but the debug log file in your root folder is still listed as untracked. This is how you can be very precise. In the next section, we will look at how to make an exception to a rule. Now let's look at a more advanced rule, how to make an exception. This is called a negation pattern, and you use an exclamation mark. Let's say you have a broad rule, like star.log, which ignores all log files. But you have one single log file that you want Git to track. You can do this by adding a new line, exclamation mark followed by the file name. This tells Git, do not ignore this one file. One important rule. This exception must come after the rule it is undoing. So, in your gitignore file, you would first have ignore rule, for example, start.log, and then the negation rule like exclamation file name you want to ignore.log. Now, when you run git status, Git will ignore all the log files, but it will still see important.log as an untracked file, ready to be added. In the next section, we will look at a very common problem, what to do if you have already committed a file that you meant to ignore. Now let's cover the most common problem you will face with gitignore. You add a file to your gitignore file, but it keeps showing up in git status. This happens because gitignore only works on new files that have never been tracked. If you have ever run git add or git commit on a file, Git will track it forever, even if you add it to your gitignore. To fix this, you must first tell Git to stop tracking the file. The command for this is git rm, followed by the cached flag and then the file name. This is a safe command. It does not delete the file from your computer. It only removes the file from Git's tracking. After you run this command, Git status will show the file as deleted, which just means it's staged to be removed from tracking. It will also show up as untracked. But now, because its name is in your gitignore, Git will ignore it from now on. In the final section, we will look at how Git decides which ignore rule to use. Finally, let's talk about precedence. Because you can have more than one gitignore file, Git actually reads rules from 3 different places. First is the local gitignore file. This is the one inside your project, and it is the one you share with your team. Second, you can have one global ignore file. This file is just for you and holds your personal rules that you want to apply to every repository on your computer. Third, there is a system-wide file, but it is rarely used. So how do they work together? There is a clear rule of precedence. Local rules always take precedence over global rules. This is most important for making exceptions. A rule in your local gitignore file can unignore a file that was ignored by your global file. This same logic applies to subdirectories. A rule in a subfolder's gitignore file will take precedence over a rule in the root folder. This allows your shared, project-specific files to override your personal global settings. In the next section, we will look at a concrete example of this. Okay, let's look at a concrete example of this. Imagine you have 3 ignore files. First, your global file ignores star.log and star.env. Second, your local project file in the root ignores the build folder, but it also has an exception on the production env file. Third, inside your project's logs folder, you add another gitignore file with one line, !error.log. Now, here is the result. Any debug log file will be ignored, thanks to the global rule. The main.env file will be ignored, thanks to the global rule. The build folder will be ignored, thanks to the local rule. But the production env file will be tracked. The local exception overrides the global rule of not to track any env files. And the error log will also be tracked, because the subdirectory's exception overrides the global rule. This is how you can build a powerful, layered system for ignoring files. That's all for today's video. Thanks for watching. If you liked this, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notified about new content. A link to the code and the markdown file is included in the description section below. See you in the next video.